Hello there, Lindsay here. Today we're going to do a vintage style pen and ink drawing, and then we're going to do a watercolor wash on it. It's a really pretty technique. I'm working on a watercolor card here by Strathmore. I have it clipped down to a piece of mat board. You can, tape it to whatever or clip it. You don't really need to tape it because we're not going to put tons of paint on there, so it shouldn't warp. I've done a very, very light sketch with a pink col erase pencil. I've really been enjoying sketching with the erasable colored pencils recently because I just feel like it gives your brain like kind of a fresh approach versus drawing with a pencil, and also you don't get any smudging. So I really recommend these, and you can find all the supplies I'm using today from our sponsor jerrysartorama.com. I have my Turner watercolors here in my palette just off screen, and we're going to be doing our drawing with Pitt pens. You could use any waterproof pen. You just want to make sure that it is waterproof because we'll be doing watercolor on top. This little wallet set of Pitt pens comes in a extra small tip, a fine tip, a brush tip, and a, I think that's a super fine. Let's see, we got extra small, we've got this one that's small, and we got this one that is fine. So fine is actually thicker than the small and the extra small. I think I'll start off with the small tip, the S tip. Make sure I don't mess them up here. They are marked on the barrel as well. I probably won't be using the brush tip one, so I'm just going to set that one aside. And like I mentioned, I've done a preliminary sketch here with my col erase pencils. So when I am drawing, I just try to make sure that my lines are pretty neat. So I'll do like a petal at a time, and just by putting in some lines ahead of time, it just helps me not have to think so much when I'm drawing, so that way I won't have lines overlapping, which is what I don't want. I want my lines to be nice and clean. I can have lines overlapping in my pencil sketch because that's fine. I just can erase those after. Even though it's a colored pencil, it's an erasable colored pencil. And I can also, I can change things if I'm looking back at my photograph. I can say, that should be a little bit different. Or after I've had a chance to, take a look at what I want to draw in my drawing, I can say, okay, I want like a little turn of a petal here, or I want something different there. So I can do all of that at that time. You can find lots of great reference images from seed catalogs. That's one of my favorite. You can also you can search vintage clip art and then the type of flower or plant you're looking for, and you'll find so many beautiful images that you can use. Most of them are in the public domain because they're older. You can search for Victorian style clip art too and get some really gorgeous images that way. And you can also find books that are printed. You can find, there's actually, I think Jerry's sells it. There's a coloring book called The Art of Nature, and that's got some gorgeous botanical plants and also like animals. So that might be something that you might be interested in if you want a printed copy, because sometimes it's nice just to have something printed out. I'm hoping that these lines are showing up good for you, as it is a fine marker or fine tip pen. I try to just kind of do the petals that are in front and then tuck the ones in back as I go around, just to kind of keep it so I don't make an error and end up overlapping or having, like, I wouldn't want to see the lines from that petal in the middle of the lines of that one, you know what I mean? So I kind of work front to back when I'm doing this. And my basic sketch is very plain. I'll add these little wiggles on my petals when I'm doing the pen. But it does really help to have a little sketch in there to help guide you. And you can take as much time as you want with this. You could even, if you found a design you really liked, you could, I'm just trying to keep my hand out of the way, so if that looks really awkward, I'm sorry about that. You could even like trace a botanical image if you wanted to, but I think it's fun to draw. If you don't enjoy that and you just want to practice your inking and painting, then you certainly can do that. So when I get in the center, what I tend to do is I work around this area, and then I'll just, when I get to the middle, I'll just kind of tuck in little petals as I find room for them, so that way I don't end up with too much awkward stuff happening, because like I mentioned, my sketch was really loose. So there, I've got the flower pretty much done. I want to do this rosebud up here. Let's start off with this leaf. The thing I love about Victorian illustrations is that they were often very ornate and kind of overdone a little bit, almost to the point where they're just, you know, they're prettier than the plant would have been. You know, they're just a little bit more romanticized, and I like that. I like that kind of opulence, and plus it gives you lots of fun lines to draw. You could do some stippling on here if you wanted to, like if you wanted to have some like more shading done with a pen, you could do that. I like to get the little edges on the petals that are kind of serrated. Rose petals have those pretty serrated edges. And the more work you do with the pen, the less you have to do with the paint. And the thing that's really nice about this is that even if you don't have the best quality watercolors, like maybe you're using your kids' watercolors, or maybe you're not using watercolor paints, but you're taking a marker and you're just like scribbling a marker onto a plate and using that as your watercolor, that's going to be fine with this, because you've done so much of the work with your pen. Sometimes I'll leave kind of a more of a rough line to indicate a stem, like a thorny stem. And it's, you know, it's up to your, you know, whatever you like. And, you know, you could spend a long time doing your drawing here, so that's up to you. Spend as much time as you're comfortable spending. A couple more leaves around the base of the flower, and since this one's in front, I want to get this one done first before I work on that one that's tucked in behind. Feel free to turn your paper if it's more comfortable for you. I don't like to put too much detail on the veining because I like a lighter look, but you can go in and put a lot more detail in there if you want to. I just like a little bit more of just a suggestion. And then I'll, you know, put shading in more with my paint, but like if you wanted shading in there, you could just do a lot of dots, do stippling, or you could, you know, cross hatch or whatever you like to do. Keep it all pen if you want to. I really like the kind of broken lines rather than a solidly inked line. But you'll develop your own preferences the more you draw. Got this leaf in here that I see. I kind of did my stem over the leaf. I didn't intend to do that, so that's all right. They're both green, so it won't be that big of a deal. Now, when you're working with pens on watercolor paper, watercolor paper has a little bit of a tooth to it, so you might want a hot press or smooth watercolor paper just to save your pens a little bit. And you also get a smoother line. That's probably one of the reasons I like to skip a little bit, is because with a cold press watercolor paper, it could wear down your pens a little bit, and I don't want that to happen. So once you've got your inking done, you can go in with finer and darker tips if you want to. I'm going to leave it just like this, but I am going to go in and erase some of my my lines. Now, the thing is, when you use a lot of these erasable colored pencils, your eraser often will kind of get stained. So what I'm going to do is erase on my scratch paper here that's under my painting supplies. That way, or I'll erase it on my jeans, and then I'll go in and gently erase any of the lines I think might bother my watercolor. Like if I've got some lines going beyond my drawing, I'll just kind of go in and lighten those up. I like to use a plastic eraser for this, a white plastic eraser, because it's just more gentle on my watercolor paper. You don't have to get everything out of there, just the, I would just get any stray lines out. And the same thing with graphite. If you're using a graphite pencil, I would do the same. Now I'm going to just use this big brush and brush it over my trash can. All right. It's up to you whether you want to put a background in or not. Usually your botanicals don't have a background, so, you know, that's completely up to you. I'll just leave the background off today, but, you know, go ahead and do a background if you want. I'm going to start with a wash for my flower, my focal point flower. So what I'm going to do is just wet the flower first. I'm using a number 12 round. You don't have to use such a large brush if you're not comfortable with that. And I'm not even going right up to the edge because I can get in there with my smaller brush when I go to add color. Alright, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I do want to make sure my colors will blend and be subtle, so I'm just kind of tipping it to see what I've wet. You can see it catch the light. Then I'll take my number 8 round. Use a number 6 if the 8 feels a little big. And I'm going to look at some colors here. I'm going to take a cooler yellow, like a Hansa yellow light. I'm going to grab a rose red. I love that color in the Turner line. It's so pretty. I'm going to start with the rose red in the center. And do a little bit here on the outside. Then and you do, when you get to these outer petals, just, oh shoot, I overdid it. Just to kind of pull the color out to the edge. I'm going to go ahead and turn my paper. I did want to keep it, I did want to keep it straight for the video, but I'm going to make sure that I don't make a big mess of this. Or we'll end up with the background anyway, which wouldn't be the end of the world. Super subtle with your colors here. And get a little more of that pink on its own out here. Real subtle colors. Now I'm going to take some of the pink and yellow, make myself a peach. When you have a cool red and a cool yellow, instead of getting an orange, you're going to get more of a peach, which is what I wanted here. Get that kind of the bowl of the flower. If you think of this as a saucer with a teacup sitting on top or a bowl sitting on top, this is kind of the bowl area. That would be the saucer area. That's usually what I think of when I'm drawing like a vintage rose like this. I think of the teacup and saucer. I'm going to blot my brush out. Well, I'm actually going to rinse it off and blot the excess water and grab some of the yellow kind of on its own. And throw that in there too. Get that nice blush going. Isn't that pretty? And anywhere you want that, you can go in. Now this is going to dry a little bit lighter. If you do see some areas that you want to highlight, what you can do is wipe your brush off. Like this maybe turn petal area, you can go in and wipe that out. Wipe your brush. This turned petal here. Wipe your brush. Any area you want to highlight, maybe this edge here, wipe your brush. And just keep going around and lifting out these subtle highlights. These aren't going to be really strong. There, we're going to let that dry. While that's drying, we can go on to another part of our picture. We can do, since we've got our reds colors out, our flower color out, I'm going to go ahead and just do a light wash on the rose buds. Just pretty much that pink on its own. I'm not even pre-wetting it because it's such a small area. when you think of like the Victorian tradition of watercolors, it was a very ladylike craft, and it was very pale and subtle and dainty. And when you see the vintage Victorian illustrations of flowers, you see a lot of that that reflected in the art of the time, that kind of light, dainty look. Now I'm going to grab some sap green. And I'm using the sap in the Turner line because it's a little bit brighter than the olive. I generally prefer their olive, but we want this to be a little bit lighter and brighter. And we're going to go ahead and give all of our leaves a wash of this pretty sap green, and you do not need to pre-wet them. But look how light my paint is. Look how watery it is. See it on my palette? It's nice and watery. We're going to do that to all of these guys. This is such a fun, relaxing project to do. And I like doing this on these watercolor cards because how pretty would it be to send this off to somebody? You know, you have some fun relaxation time in your day to paint this, and then you get to send it to somebody. When you go up next to the flower here, leave a gap, otherwise you are going to get paint. It's going to flow into your flower. And this is not a loose style watercolor. This is a botanical, more of a botanical, vintage kind of botanical style. Not super detailed botanical style, but it's not a loose style, so we don't want our colors flowing together like that. And we're just going to go and continue on. I apply some color and then I work out from that edge so I don't end up with cauliflowers or blooms. This is an inexpensive paper. This is a cellulose or wood-based paper, so it does not have the properties of a cotton paper, which would kind of stay wet longer and allow you to blend longer. So we want to kind of work out from one area and fill in our shape. I buy these boxes by the 100 of these watercolor cards because they're so handy. And they're not precious because they're not really expensive. You can get a pack of 10 for like $5 or something. It's pretty inexpensive. I am going to turn this around though so I don't drag my hand across any of that wet paint and get these guys painted. Things, if you haven't pre-wet the petals, they're probably dry. Like these little rosebuds are probably dry by now. Especially if you have, you know, your heat on and I've noticed the air is a lot drier in the house now. This is last week especially, with the heat on. And so if you had a lot of detail in that first, in your pen and ink, if you had lots of detail there, this might be all of the painting you want to do. You might just want to do this one flat wash and call it a day. Because if you have a lot of detail with the pens, then you don't really need to do, you know, a lot of shading and whatnot with a watercolor. So let your style be your guide. If you feel like you like the way it looks at the stage that it's at and you don't want to add any more to it, then don't. That's completely up to you. Okay, so now we want to let this dry and then we'll go and do another layer. We're going to switch to some smaller brushes now. The brushes I've been using are from the Mimic line of watercolor brushes from Jerry's Artorama. These are the Mimic Squirrel. They're a faux squirrel brush. They're very absorbent, and I like them a lot for these techniques. I think we'll use number 4 and number 2. And I'm going to start off with the number 2 because I'm going to start off with these little rosebuds up here. And I'm going to grab some of the rose red. Now, one of the things I like about this is that it's not going to hold too much paint, this smaller brush, so I shouldn't end up with big gobs of paint I can't control. I also want to get out a little bit of blue, and I'm going to use a little bit of phthalo blue because I'm also going to need a blue for the green. And if I used ultramarine blue, it would turn the greens a little muddy. So I'm just getting a little phthalo blue out there. If you got Prussian blue's fine. I don't have Prussian in this palette. That's what I would actually prefer to use, would be Prussian. So I'm going to mix that up and get myself kind of like a purpley pink color. And that's what I'm going to use for my darkest colors here. And I'm just going to, and you know, I've got to tell you that typically my head would be a lot closer to my picture. I'm sitting back a bit, so if I go outside of the lines, that's probably going to be why. I like to go in with my darks and get those values established. If you know, you could go in with your midtones. It's probably a little more customary to go in with your midtones and then layer your darks last with watercolor, but I do like to go in and get that that midtone, that dark in first, just so I kind of know, yeah, how dark my darks are going to be, because sometimes if you just work light to dark, you can end up with all your values being too light, and then you go in and you put your shadows in, your darks, and you realize that you need to readjust everything. And I don't want to do that. I find that this is a much more accurate way to paint for me anyway. It's a heck of a lot faster too. I'm going to pull up little veins while I'm at it with my brush. So it can kind of look a little bit cartoony at this stage because we've just got we've got our super lights and our super darks, but once we add the midtones in, it's going to be fine. You will have to reload quite a bit because when you are working with such a small brush, you're carrying such a small amount of paint. Okay. I'm going to let those dry before I go on to adding more. Now, I don't see as many darks in the main flower as I do in the buds, and I'm just going to do that bud later because I don't want to drag my hand in it when I'm doing the center flower. I'm seeing more of just a really intense rose for the darks in the center, so I'm going to go ahead and start in with that. And notice how I'm mixing my paint down so it's like 1% milk consistency. And I'm loading that brush because I don't want to have to reload tons and tons of times. And I'm going to start here in the center where I'm seeing the darkest areas, and I'm going to go in and paint those values in. And they're generally going to be underneath a petal, so it's going to be, if you've got some petals overlapping, you're going to put your shadow on the one underneath. I hope that makes sense. So if you see like the tip, the edge of a petal, it kind of looks like you're putting it above that petal, but really what it is, it's a shadow on the one in behind it. I hope that makes sense. So I'm just going in and adding those darker colors, and that's just the rose red on its own, fairly concentrated. And let's see, don't have too much of that in towards the back, just some little little outlines here and there. I'm putting my darkest values. So then as you work forward, you could be seeing this darker value underneath a petal. Like if you've got a turned area here, I would put the shadow underneath that. And when in doubt, just go maybe a little on the light side or on the skinny side maybe. You can see as you start to run out of paint, you can kind of dry brush a little bit before you reload. Now I do want to have a little bit of that purple right here because it is a little bit darker there. So I just want to do that right while this layer is still wet so I can have that dark layer all as one layer. Hope that makes sense. And I do see a little bit of that more purpley color back there. And a little bit, let's put a little bit right in this crease here. I need a little more water because my paint won't flow. Super small amounts of paint here. It's not how I generally work, but it is kind of fun sometimes to do something a little bit different. And I'm just kind of seeing if there's any other places I want to add a little bit of that darkest values. I'll go back in with the midtones just like I will with the buds, but I just want to get those darks in there for the time being. Okay, now we'll go down to that rosebud. We'll get a little bit more of the blue, a little bit more of the red. And it's going to be darker where the leaves are overlapping. And in here as well. And I hope you didn't hear my tummy growl. Getting close to lunchtime. Okay. Now while that's drying, we're going to do the same thing with the leaves. We're going to take some of the phthalo blue, such a pretty color, and some more of the sap green. Mix that together, make a nice dark value, and we're going to do the same thing but to the leaves. I'm going to turn this around because I'm afraid I'm going to drag my hand through it. And just get some of these darks in there. I had a little bead of water on my brush. I don't want that. You can indicate some veining in there as well. Your shadows will be strongest where you've got overlapping, just like with the petals. Also, you'll oh my gosh, having a hard time talking today. You'll often find that with a rose petal, like it's like almost like the plant wants to fold in half, and you'll see one half of the flower will have a lot more shadow than the other half. My tummy again, my goodness. And you can put some, I like to put some chunky strokes in here because it almost looks like, if you've ever seen vintage fabric, I love vintage fabric, and it kind of has those kind of big chunky patterns, the way that they print the fabric, and that's kind of like one of the effects that I really like to get when I'm doing this. So it goes from Victorian botanicals to a Victorian like fabric, or even just a vintage fabric print. I love that look. Mix up a little bit more of that. I feel like I want a little bit warmer of a color too, so I'm going to add a little bit of that yellow that we originally had used in our flower. So I'm adding some of that in here as well. And if you want this to look really botanical, then, you know, I would find some really detailed botanical illustrations, and I would plan on spending quite a bit of time and really, you know, going for it, really putting in all that detail. We don't have the time to do that here on YouTube, but that's certainly something that you could take a few hours and do at home Absolutely. And you can just see, just by adding that second layer on everything, how much more refined and detailed it looks. It's amazing, the more time you put into something, the more higher end results you can get. And I mean, sometimes you just want to do a loose watercolor, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's beautiful too. But you know, if you're willing to put more time in, you can get, you know, really spectacular results. Just depends on the style you're going for and, you know, the mood that you're in. I mean, this might be a little more time than somebody wants to put into a greeting card, and that's fine. I just felt like that needed a little bit more darkening now that it's dried and it's shifted a little bit. This will dry fast, though. This technique dries real fast, which is nice. Okay, so now we're going to go in with the rose red. We're going to do those mid-tones. And I'm just going to do 3 layers here. I did highlights, the darks, and the midtones. That's all I'm doing. If you want to do more, you go right ahead. And the midtones can be a little more sloppy. Sloppy is probably the wrong word, but they can be a little bit looser, I guess is more what I mean. A little more water in that. So you want this to kind of be in between where your highlight color wash was and where your dark was. I'm just using the rose on its own, but you could use a little bit of the yellow in there if you want to. I am still kind of keeping it like to the shadow areas. And you can, if you see an area that you're like, oh, that should be a little bit darker, you can go in and add that darker and then just kind of let it float out into the shadow. Oh, into the mid-tone rather. If you get too much, you can just kind of go into the wet brush and lift some or spread it out a little bit. And remember, you are going to have a little bit of mellowing out as it dries. And I'm hardly looking at our reference now because I've got the foundation stuff in. Just drag in some mid-tone streaks from the outside of the petals to give it a little bit of that petal texture, and that's always nice. Use a little bit of form and shape. I want a little bit darker. I'm going to go over the shadow, but pretty much just with the red up here because I just feel like I want it a little bit more intense and a little bit brighter, a little bit more saturated. The purple is a little less saturated. When you mix a color, it tends to desaturate it a little bit. I'm going to do the same over here. And just kind of drag some of that out. And drag some of it in so I have the highlight kind of in the center of the petal where it's curved and hitting the light. Helps give it a little more form. If that looks too stripy for your liking, then you can use a bigger brush, or you could not do so many of the stripes. Just kind of keep it more chunky instead of stripy. Okay, and I think I want a little bit of that mid-tone up here too, just kind of in the bowl under that edge, just a little bit more of that. And you can go in and, you know, clean anything up, intensify anything you want. if you're going to have marks, I would try to keep them kind of like in the direction of the veining, just so it helps sell the flower aspect. Okay, I like the way that looks. Let's do a little mid-tone on the petals down here. Pretty much going over all the shadow and just leaving a little bit of highlight. And I'm going to switch to a larger brush to do the mid-tone on the leaves. I'm going to go with my number 8 round. I'm going to use sap green, and I'm actually going to add some yellow to it, but not as much water as we had in that original mix. So I know it looks super vibrant, doesn't it? It looks very much like a leaf green, and I'm just going to be doing kind of like a broad stroke on these. Look at what the difference that yellow makes in the mix. That yellow really kicks it up. I like to have some of the original layers showing, just for that variety. I do like to go over the darker ones with this mid-tone just because it livens it up a little bit. Leaves might need another pass through with some dark, but that's up to you. Or you can always go in with more pen. I like that nice bright green though, that's pretty. But think of like how fabric is printed and it's just kind of coming through that final layer of stamping from a, you know, from a fabric roller. I think I really like that effect myself. And I think I'm going to throw a couple other stems in there, because it just seems a little like I've got a little bit too much empty space there. And I think I'm going to call it done. You can, of course, do more to that if you want to. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please check out our sponsor, jerrysartarama.com, for these watercolors, pens, and brushes that I used today. Of course, the paper cards, too. You can get those there as well. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, I would appreciate a thumbs up, and tell your friends if they like to paint, too, and you think they would enjoy my tutorials. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy crafting.